You know, when I started my career in academia about 12, 13 years ago, I had to convince my colleagues, my dean, my students to really put on programs on sustainability at the business school in particular. And this year, I teach this class on global governance and sustainability, and it was the most popular elective that we have on the MSc in international management. So I think, and I think this turnout we have here today, I think it's another sign that, the revolution is coming that Heidi referred to. And we have talked about different elements of the revolution. We've talked about the consumers, about businesses, about finance, and I really want to because I think we always have to think about how can we push this further, and I want to talk now about the workers, who are, especially when we talk about the human side of sustainability, are the main beneficiaries. But I think often they have been conspicuously absent from, the design of governance initiatives in global supply chains. And so I really want to talk about how can we bring the workers and the voice of the workers back in some of the very difficult context, such as, we talked about Bangladesh, but many other countries where our supply chains originate in. To this end, I want to talk about my research that I've conducted together with my colleague Jimmy Donaghy from the University of Warwick, and also in collaboration with the joint ETIs, on how can we move from social auditing and supply chains to social dialogue, because I think that's really a next paradigm of how we can engage workers in supply chains. The main one of the main ways of how we've thought about avoiding risks and improving labor standards, environmental standards, has been around codes of conduct and social auditing. But I think at least since the collapse of the Rana Plaza factory almost, to this date 5 years ago, I think really demonstrated that social auditing is no longer an option, or it's not longer a sufficient option to prevent such terrible tragedies and to really empower workers and give them a voice. Not only have 2 of the garment factories inside the Rana Plaza building been audited against codes of conduct, as Luis mentioned, which have failed to pick up the issues, but also on the day before, already large crack emerged on the outside of the buildings. And the supermarkets, the bank, and shops that were inside the same complex, they closed, but workers did not have a voice, even though they knew about the crack, and they knew that this was a potentially dangerous building, because there has been a series of accidents, fatal accidents, in the Bangladeshi garment industry before. So they knew it was a potentially dangerous situation. They didn't feel they had a strong enough voice to refuse unsafe work. And so, as so many tragedies, this was an entirely avoidable tragedy if the workers have had a voice to refuse the work. So I want to talk about how can we empower workers through social dialogue and focus on the Bangladesh case, because after Rana Plaza, as tragic as it was, Bangladesh has also been a country where some of the most interesting innovations in promoting social sustainability have occurred. So I want to draw on some research that I've done in Bangladesh. Probably I don't have to convince you about the limitations of social auditing anymore, but I think it's an approach that is structurally flawed for just 3 reasons. I just want to very briefly rehearse. So first of all, here we talk about the power of collective action, the power of brands and multiple stakeholders coming together. However, social auditing has remained in predominantly individualistic approach, where often each brand has their own code of conduct, which leads to multiple duplication of audits at the factory level. So some of the suppliers we talk to, they say, we have an audit on average every week. So there's auditing going on and picking up of the problems, but not much time then being spent on working on the solution. So there's an audit fatigue, both on the side of suppliers and on the side of buyers as well. And there are low incentives for suppliers to actually improve on the conditions, because often, even though some non-compliances might be picked up, often buyers, especially individual buyers, might not always follow up. That was actually the case in the Tezrin factory, which happened 6 months before Rana Plaza, where over 100 workers died due to a fire. And also very avoidable tragedy, some of the fire exits were locked. So people were locked inside the building and couldn't get out. And we talked to one of the international brands. They conducted some audits just a few weeks before the fire happened, and they said, well, we had a bad feeling about this factory. We looked at all the evidence, and we thought this wasn't a safe enough factory to put our orders. Many other brands who sourced from there had access to the same information, but did not follow up on this. So for individual suppliers, then often, supplying to a large number of brands, there's not enough incentives to really also improve on the non-compliances, even if they're picked up. Then, and I think that's one of the main problems, is that it's externally driven. It's external auditors, people from outside, who come periodically into the factory and check against an audit protocol. So it's designed and enforced often by external actors, by buyers. So the standards are determined outside the workforce and are also then implemented from outside rather than from within. The workers are often not part of the design of these standards. They're not part of the enforcement, not part of the implementation of these standards. But I think if you really want to think about how sustainably labor standards can be enforced, the workers actually really have to be part of the conversation. Finally, social auditing is also profit-driven as an exercise. So there have been some estimates that this is a $80 billion global industry, and there's a strong interest of auditors to maintain frequent visits. In that sense, we really have to think of how can we, put this back into the interest of workers who are the actual beneficiaries. So, what is social auditing? Social dialogue. So, according to the ILO definition of social dialogue, it includes all types of negotiation, consultation, and exchange of information between or among representatives of governments, employers, and workers on issues of common interest relating to economic and social policy. So according to the ILO definition, and in many countries where social dialogue is practiced, it exists on 3 levels. So you can have tripartite social dialogue involving government, employers, and workers. But you can also have bipartite social dialogue at the sector level involving employers and employees. And what I want to talk about is about workplace social dialogue. So also bipartite social dialogue at the workplace, at the factory, between employees, between the workers and the employers. The main goal of social dialogue itself is to promote consensus building and democratic involvement among the main stakeholders in the world of work. And social dialogue is, unlike maybe auditing, it's not either or, it's not, it's there, it's not there, it's an ongoing process. And I think maybe this pyramid can reflect how we can think about social dialogue. And at the very bottom of the pyramid is an information sharing mechanism, so which increases transparency within the workplace about things that are going on. So this is the basis for workers to be engaged, know what's going on, to feel involved. Then we can think about a consultative mechanism, where not only information is shared, but also workers are consulted upon maybe changes that are introduced. The next step would be negotiation mechanism, where workers are part of the consensus finding, negotiating solutions, maybe jointly, up all the way to joint decision makings, where workers in the workplace, together with management, make decisions on issues that are of common interest. So probably for different issues, social dialogue will take place, might be more on the information sharing side, might be more on the negotiation mechanism side. So it's an ongoing process. What does this mean in the Bangladesh context? So luckily in Bangladesh, the labor law is very supportive of social dialogue. The Bangladesh labor law supports a principle with its provision in the labor law on participation committees. And these participation committees have to be democratically elected. That was actually an amendment to the labor law that came in after Rana Plaza collapsed under pressure, amongst others, by the ILO. And worker and employer representatives are represented in equal numbers. Worker representatives, if there is a trade union in place, they're appointed by the trade union. If there's no trade union in place, or until the time a trade union may be in place, they're elected. And that's very important because in our research that we conducted has shown that in most cases, in the Bangladesh context, the members of the participation committees, the worker members, they're appointed by management. And so it's a very different story of representing the workers if they're not elected. So the first thing is actually to have elected representatives. They're different from trade unions. The function is not to carry out collective bargaining, and that's a very important difference. And in structure, they're kind of, they're similar to the Works Council model in Germany, where you also have, where even social dialogue can be a complement to trade unions in the workplace and not a supplement. And I think that's very important to emphasize. And so social dialogue is really a mechanism of where workers and managers come together in a regular forum to talk about issues of common concern. And we have observed in our research some of these participation committee meetings that took place in the Bangladesh context. And it was very, very heartening, very, very wonderful to see how you see some workers, some female workers as well, because in Bangladesh, 80% of the workforce in garments is female workers. They rise up and create an agenda of issues that are of their concern. And some of them are around, harassment in the workplace, poor relationships between supervisors and workers, hygiene issues in the workplace. So all kind of wages, of course, is, even though there's no collective bargaining, but even just transparency around how wages are paid, or getting leave for workers. So many issues that can be brought to the table and rather be addressed in an adversarial way, that can be addressed jointly with management together in the room. Now, there are many contextual hurdles for participation committees and social dialogue in a context like Bangladesh. There's very, very poor government oversight. So that's why most participation committees are appointed rather than elected. There's a very weak trade union structure. There's about 3% density and 6% coverage of trade unions in Bangladesh. So amongst over 4,000 officially registered factories that export, according to estimates and some research that we've done, there might be as few as 20 very well-functioning unions. And that is also due to the structure of enterprise-level unionism in the Bangladesh context, where there's very high turnover, and if a worker leaves a particular factory, they lose their union membership, and that leads to very high fragmentation. So it's a very immature system of industrial relations. It's also a very adversarial system of industrial relations, where because of low capacity, there's not very much consultation and dialogue going on. And then there's this vast inequality between managers and workers. Workers often coming from the countryside, often being illiterate, and to really move to a situation where managers and workers can meet eye to eye and talk about these issues is a huge challenge. But also, that's also why it's potentially so transformative to introduce social dialogue and show workers and also create role models of workers who can rise up and talk about these issues with managers. So just to talk about some of the benefits of social dialogue. So it creates democratic involvement of workers who become part of resolving issues at the workplace. So it creates an enabling environment for worker voice. And also enables workers to address issues that are of concern to them. It promotes safety from within the workplace, because we think about safety not being an either-or, but something that is enforced on a very daily basis. It's about a culture that is lived. It's workers who know whether the exit doors are locked or not, and they see that on a daily basis. So if they can be part of the conversation, there's much better chance to ensure safety is there on a sustainable basis. It's also prerequisite for well-functioning organizational health and safety committees in the Bangladesh context, because the participation committee then nominates members for this committee. And so if you have capacity of social dialogue being there, you can have much better functioning health and safety committees as well. It also contributes to industrial relations and industrial peace, where it has the chance to improve the relationship between managers and workers from one of adversarial relations to one of dialogue and consensus building, joint problem solving before problems really escalate in the workplace. And finally, it promotes better working conditions. So it's a problem-solving approach to non-compliances that may or may not be picked up by the audits. And it moves from one to just seeing what are the non-compliances to one making workers part of the solution to addressing them. I see the sign of 0 minutes. I could speak for this forever. But I think I will stop here and rather leave more time for questions that we may have on social dialogue, and look forward to also, if you're interested more in the workshop we have later this afternoon.
I have to take the question which has most likes right now. How do I start the process of identifying if social dialogue exists in the factories in my supply chain?
That's a good question. So first, identifying. I think one thing to identify is whether there's a trade union in place. And if there's a trade union in place, there's already a very good structure where the capacity of the trade union can be strengthened to create social dialogue as a mechanism. However, as we've seen in the case of Bangladesh, often there are no trade unions in place. So I think, for me, and no doubt, I think union representation, I think, should be the best way to represent workers. But in a context where this is so difficult and there's industrial relations are so immature, I think social dialogue is kind of a starting point. I think, again, it depends on which country you're operating. If you're operating in Bangladesh, there should be a participation committee already in place, because that's part of the law. However, it might not be elected. So I think the first thing to find out is whether it's in place, whether it's elected, or whether it's been appointed by management, which is often not very easy. So often you have to enter in conversation with managers to find that out, and with the workers as well.
So just a very short, it's a following up, a very short answer on this question. How can we tackle social dialogue at workplace in jurisdiction that do not support the right to independent organizing?
Yeah, that's. I think that's definitely a challenge, but I think that's also a possibility to use social dialogue as kind of a way around this because it can also enhance the relationship between managers and workers in the workplace. So it's also something to improve the could be a way to improve human resource management. So it's also beneficial to the factory owners. But definitely, I think if you have a legal context that helps, it's of course much easier. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Juliane.
Thank you.